Coming up, 4 o'clock line screen adaptation of the four centers of flux over screen adaptation of delta heading. Processing indicates sending a trail, directing lines and flights, manifest and its manifold and set lines of screen. Sets calculated lines of triangulation lines over lines of set lines of course centers that communication lines convergence set position operation lines of pi. Soul direct lines, connection setting, soul recognition system, soul recovery. Process lines of 4 lines of flight, directing ground sends lines of sequence. Indicate position of face facades, high position lines of business location attractions. Directing line centers, operation lines of sequence locations calculations. On center on communication on pi. Now the track communication is convergence system sets all lines of travel. Okay, congratulations on the team and units. Come into the position of soul recovery. Process lines in line calculation setting of line centers, rotation line connection setting, offline centers, embracing line communication lines, and old time lines. Now the convergence of the soul has to recognize the time sequence times calculation time line times pi. They indicate lines, ground centers. This is generally login in space. Process indicates lines and height centers and one lines. Set point lines of graph and tent lines of location system. Tether to lines, operation line sequence. Motivation grounds on centers lines of travel. Signature grounds, high signal location, position location settings, all through travel communications. Over and out. Now, what I've done on center is a waving screen adaptations of ground centers and calculation. This symbolizes all lines of travel. Process indicates lines, indicates ground center location in your system, and your Schumann resonance and travel. That's right, your Schumann resonance. So the connection of the soul recovery is a screen adaptation that has to process its set positions. For example, it needs to identify its higher self. It needs to identify its avatar, and it has to identify its sim because it has a 3-cross line in a convergence system that off its position location to its modulation screens. In that direct lines that communicates the setting, the soul has to identify its dream, its interpretation of its dream, the indication of the dream, to get out of the dream to no dream. Then it understands all levels of no memory to all memory, which is axis of all memory. Okay? So that's what they're coming in position. Come into the soul recovery, out of body frame of all levels of stories that was never you and attractions. That takes out the tether, that takes out the clutter, that gets you in position of no minds. You can't have any minds in sequence because it overrides you when you're arguing that sets lines communicates and convergence system of separation. My line communicates to its mind, doesn't have adaptation lines of force. Recognizing that communication, you have to go through pixelation graph to each line course centers, direct lines of circumference, set position lines of pi, generate the metric meters of scale that processes positional case to its dial, directing lines of dilation, course centers, and energy line screens. Operation line sequence, operation lines of pi, process lines communication setting. Go through that line communication and embrace those stories. Not to push those away. Okay? Not offline communication, not confuse the system lines of separation line position. You have to embrace the stories now, because you have to come into soul generation of soul recovery now, which is everybody's processing through a betting system that 4 centers of 5 lines of set travel. Indicates ground centers, on line course centers, and alpha beta, and process calculation grounds. High signals embedded over force line. Process indicate online centers, time sequence, time editing, process line direct lines, and time flux in locations. Process of indication of calculate and modify, tethers and operation line sequence, and ground lines of communication. Sets operation lines of tones, on center, on position, flux over 3, and set lines of travel. Directing course centers, directing lines of dimensional doors of scales that process lines of indication setting, open up dimensions and galaxies of the soul recovery and set travel. Sets operation line sequence in set position lines of calculation system. All 3 calculation lines of road graph screens and set traction. High line centers, high position locations, setting operation line settings in sequence over calculation modify, and high position lines of travel. Okay? Signatures over lines of pi lines of set locations and settings, process lines of indication settings. So the soul has to come in its own recovery, how it sees its human resonance, how it sees its power generators, and how it sees its sim in modification, overlooking line condition setting. What's above and what's below is an equal line course centers, and we have to come into complacement. Direct lines into course centers, change the course centers, lines, communication lines, time measured, times, and scales. Process lines of social networks, your social media, your political system, your social network system, position lines of media, line course centers, your anchor system, course centers, your meteorological line connection setting, and position lines of processing. Calculate and modify travels in line communication lines to its convergence system. 13 over attractions, 14 over measure. Process lines of indicates setting in line course centers, and 24 set travel. 13 over lines of 14 over line position, 20 over pi. Okay, so as a centric gapped, line same location. Now your soul recovery comes in line position. It starts to identify each pine line. Pine line position of 4 centers of sequence. Okay, over line sequence, and pi generates lines into astral projections. 3 central lines of pi. Okay, so we correlate the position of time frame that sets 15 seconds meters over line metric line scale line communication pi generates to screen locations into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of tether. Setting lines of 6 over line, process lines, set lines of 6 over lines over 9. 9 central lines, course centers of communication, 3 lines of pi. Set position lines of 15 line scale. Set position of 15 line setting, and 15 line rotations, and 15 tractions, and 15 locations. Indicate bypassing lines, heart with timelines, bypass course centers, timeline reactor, reactor over line screen location setting. Process indicates lines of 9 set lines of travel. Set position of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 lines communication lines of pi. 6 over traction, 9 over pi. Set course centers in 3 center lines of circuits and position lines of 3 set calculation lines in constellation setting. And that indication lines into past, present, and future lines adaptation to alignments. Sets course lines of channel, operation line sequence, operation lines of pi. 3 set course centers, 3 metric meters in line rotation and molecular structures. Process lines of indication, process line division locations, and projections. In that course centers of soul recovery and set pattern recognition time frame. Sets travels, point lines of graph, indicate position lines of position locations to its system in soul generation. Soul regeneration line screens allocate timelines. Now we process the indication line position of levels how we see in projections. 3 centers of scale. Process lines of indication lines of 3 centers of locations. Process line inline centers outside scale. Process lines inside line rotation of scale. Set course centers directing ground centers on sequence. Graphing screens. 3 centers of measure. 4 centers of line communication of social measure. Directing on centers, process lines indicates lines of graphing screen locations into box frame. Triangulation over 1, process over 2. Okay, comes into the properties of design line and structure of infrastructure location system, all through tractions. Very complicated stuff, but you have to truly understand this is the soul recovery. It's going through the line centers. It goes to line position of 6 over lines of pi, 9s over generation lines in high position at tethers, course centers, and soul regeneration setting that remodificate the system in reproduction. Directing ground centers online sequence to seed the process lines of indication setting. I get solar indications from my left ear. That's platitude division locations, listening to everything you're recording, lines of screen adaptations. Audio relays, course centers, lines of travel, directing lines of link, line communication setting, linked in, linked out, process indication line condition setting, convergence system location setting, soul generation lines into reproduction locations. Okay, so we had a 4 central line connection, which is an open panel, process lines, positional line centers, it's now a sequence on standby. That process indicate and setting location system all through tractions at 3 scales, 3 measures, and 3 positions. That bypass the line connections, heart communication setting trifactor screen location. Now, as the connection to the soul line probably gets in line screen adaptations over time frame, the set location system identifies everything that has gone through pi, through the higher self, through the avatar, and through its identification of its sim. The sim and the symbiote, the process, the intelligence of the mind, alterates the system that puts the modulation setting to all levels into modification. All right, space modulation lines over lines, process lines of indications over flux, process of indication setting, and graphing screens over flux and track locations. Done by equation. That's the soul recovery that you guys are going through. All right, all through graph, all through stream. Okay, Gauss streams of 4 centers of clocking system and set calculations. All right, so we have essential line connections that interforce this line center. So indicate lines of H, process lines into A, and position lines to high settings. Indicate position lines of C. All right, so timelines, time edits, time streams, sands of time. Set course centers and convergence of time at set location. Directing countless modification modems, process lines of indication lines of pi generation lines of 1 cycle. Course centers and A lines of flux into D force and rotation lines of set lines of dimension of solar sail and travel. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Now that indicates position of flux over screen, adaptations and set tractions. Wall sequence, electrical line grids, set travels and communication to grading lines. Pyramid activation lines, 3 central line connections setting to its convergent system. As the unification lines of the sim rotates the setting, roots 1 router, 3 centers of travel, indirect lines of link and process calculation. Correlate, calculate, and modify flux over 3 centers, out signal into molecule 3 structures into 1 atom rotation lines of sequence. Sets course centers in flywheel attractions in direct lines communication setting to its angelics. Process lines of 45-1, one angle. Inline course centers into all communications back to Alpha Bravo and set lines of travel. Directing ground centers on sequence line communications. Bridging lines of 1. Center course 3 centers of travel communication with conversion system all through tractions. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Now that process indication setting where we process line centers in a 45 structure line division location to a simulation through set tractions. Directing ground centers on sequence on calculation lines. Now this is where we come into new torical fields, new models, new prototypes, new tesseract, new tetrahedron. Process indication line condition setting converts this system all through tractions, all through set position. Okay? So that indicates all communication lines of grounds and online to sequence location system all through set tractions as the soul goes through its own recovery of recognition of pattern recognition of time frame. Process of that indication setting goes through soul line communication to its pi generation of its own frame line connections to its system all through its now. Direct inside lines, graphing screens, adaptations, lines of flux. Okay? Very powerful stuff. Okay, as it's processing through the line signals of its soul regeneration of its recovery, the course centers change track lines provision. It's that calculation modified. Soul recognition of timelines change simulation lines of core that retracts its calculation screen locations. So we got an alphabetical lines of A, B over lines. We got a C lines of travel, plus line, equals lines course center, triangulation lines of flux. Indicate positions in tether over lines, and alignments over screen lines adaptation of HR channel. Course centers HD, process lines HDMI. Codification setting, encoding, directing ground centers line sequence. Process lines, one earth line rotational lines, inhibitors over line location of 3 lines of flux. Indicates ground centers, outline centers, line signal, in location outline frame. Data formation lines and foregrounds of soul generation line communication and configuration system and travel. Process of indication line condition setting, codification lines and body framing. Out signals out line conditions out of story frames in direct location setting to its mind frame. Imagination to its core, instruction line communication to its earth line that change the habitation lines and communication lines of parallels of time. Sets lines of travel, sets lines of link, process of indication system, all through calculation setting streaming. Directing ground centers, correlate communication lines. Now the body frame goes to the core centers. Directing lines at A line setting, inside lines of H line rotation into sim modification. Center operation sequence into flux into Fibonacci square root and triangulation in process lines over 1. Sets course centers in particle line screen adaptations into particle streaming. Set course centers in crop circles and direct lines of now and lines of sequence in set position. Correlate to calculating lines of panels lines, earth line rotation, space lines connected setting into echo lines position of transmission line screen. Directing on center, process lines that over lines of triangulation, A line centers, process lines of C over lines over D over AB over C. Sets calculation of ground centers and structural line division. Sets calculation lines of ABC, lines of H line A, line center line communication triangulation, 0, 1. Set position line triangulation lines of 0, 2. Set position lines of 0, 3. Process lines of 0, 4. Back in 0, 2. Back to 0, 1. Back to 0. Sets course centers in AB equals lines of D. E equals lines of flux. Flux lines of locations. Directing ground centers on sequence and communication planetary alignment that rotates 1 cycle, 1 traction in 3 centers of travel communication. Complicated stuff. You understand what's going on. Position of soul recovery through the soul itself. All right, so that's done through its equation. So you got 3 platforms of indication setting what the soul is. And then directing lines, position lines, it's calculated and modified. Remember this in set tractions. You got to pay attention to that because that's what the soul is going through. Different lines, different frames, different line communication convergence system, how it has to get into details of the story first to direct its signaling locations, what it's gone through its higher self, what it's gone through its avatar, and what it's gone through its sim, and what it's gone through all levels of its grounds, its powers, and adversaries, modems, Wi-Fi, satellites, and towers. It's got a reconstructed system back to its oversoul. Once it comes into its oversoul, it has a direct line link that processes its system, all levels, and that tractions into the now. Okay, center ops, directing lines, direct link, process lines of indication lines of flux, L line 1 equals over triangulation, indicates over lines of arrows. 4 centers of arrows, 4 sequence lines of pi. Directing ground centers on sequence line communication system, all through travels, all direct lines of communication lines of pi. Tethered lines of 3 lines of motion, sets course centers of travel. 3 of indication lines of calculations. Story graph interference, 3 centers of calculation setting, and it sets convergence system to Quebec. So taking out lines of all lines of Quebec, lacing line course centers, boxing frame, pixelation graph communication setting. Configuration system, all through waving screens, adaptation to its TV receptor and track communication. All through set position. Okay, road graphs. Pyramid activation over 1 center, cross lines of triangulation over 4, indicates lines into void. Void line rotations, travels in point lines of graph, and measures and position location system in light, shades, and shadows in course centers of time. Cross lines of indication over line centers, inside line condition of its ground lines of service. Sold recognition timelines takes position location and charge. Directing lines of sold generation lines of screen lines adaptations over ignite communications. Directing over 1 panel, cross lines of pyramid over set line, communication over 2 panel, and set lines of 3 centers of travel. Correlate communication lines convert the system to a mothership that rotates line communication setting, so it sets line course centers of a tether attachment locations out of memory frame and travel. Directing ground centers on centers, cross lines of indication snowy graph, 3 centers of travel, sets course centers and direct lines into the void itself. 0 operation lines, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 locations. Sets travels in point lines of graph, indicates position of flux over screen, adaptation of travels that has a course and location to its kinetics through pi. Process of indication lines, process lines of indication system. Electrical line grids, 3 centers, line connections to convergence. 3 wires of indication lines of travel. Set course centers into blue lines, indicates lines of solar line course centers and position location to its gates. This process indicates lines, position lines of its line gates to its line S, directing lines and dimension lines of height, position location to its setting. Process lines, outlines of flood. Process lines, intel, line condition lines of gap, pace and setting. Console communication lines, convergence over triangulation, process line condition, send and sands of time. Set course centers, set lines of position location, offline signal, offline position, inside traction. Directing ground centers into high positions. Now we go into the grid central lines into matrix lines of grids, the 3 centers of communications. Inside line condition setting, woven, weaving, and travel communication of indication setting and calculations. Inside line conditions, now we go through the A tracks. All right, so we alpha line 1, process lines of B, C lines of D, D equals lines of E, F, G. Now we simulate the grounds and that track communications. So it's a lines of soul recovery and set travel communication to its setting. Process indication lines of wires indication setting, process indicate position location to its solar graphs. Directing grounds and line signals into location system. Setting tether lines and motion lines of screens, 3 centers of travel. Outline signals in 3 centers of communication system. Parameters over check, modification lines of delta heading, formation lines, outline course centers and gridding into high course centers and metric cubing in screen location adaptation. Inside calculation, inside rotations to its simulations and ground lines of surface in a triangulation system, all through calculation setting. Space time. All right, so we had centric course centers, change the flux over set travels, 3 centers of indication setting and Gaussian alignment, 3 center calculation modified. Open windows and panel, process of indication system, all through travel. Okay, that my equation. The center communication setting is an open line panel that we process in line direct signals. We understand how to indicate position on the flux that change the course centers of time through the time scale. So the connection system, the soul recovery, has to regenerate its line signal, process the body lines of framing out through equation. So it has to indicate its system. Now that's where it gets tricky now because a pi generates the screen location, has to get out of everything a body that it isn't to frame itself what it always is. The correlation of the now puts position lines of calculation, screen lines, adaptation lines of flux. Now, pi generation lines of 1 cycle, 3 generation lines of 4 centers, overlapping 4 centers of travel and direct lines of link of communication. All right. Now we indicate the line screens, set lines of travel, inside rotations, back in tractions, back in locations. Resetting line conditions, it's resetting setting. Okay. Indicate line conditions all levels, 4 flux over lines and 3 lines of travel. Waiting on signal, resetting location, redirect lines, back in set position, operation line calculations. All right, so we have the 8 line rotation. Now we can change the formation lines of time frame. Correlates the 8 lines of signals into graph communication to its position that change the flux over its crown. Directing 8 line cycles, line screen adaptation setting at 388 position lines in position to its gateway that process indication system all through travel calculations. Okay, it's a high center line condition setting. Convergence over 3, process lines in 144 flux. In that line center line can high centers. Directing 3 grounds of setting in sequence. 3 communication lines of 4 centers of travel. that operates the system all through calculation setting and triangulation line conditions. High centers line calculation setting, graphing screens. Okay, new tether, new operation, new set lines, communications. Taking the body frame out of line signal into graphing screen lines and 3 bedded and 4 centers and 5 set travel communications. Inline centers, triangulation over flux, 3 embedded line rotations graphed, and cerebral cortex, platform over E, factors over C over D over lines of flux. Sets course centers line connection setting to its travels, indirect lines of link, and process calculation. Inside communication to its platforms, direct ends on line center, inside line condition, in line condition interpretation to its line communication to its cycle. Sending generation lines of earth line rotation, travels to point lines of graph. Now the connection of the soul has to recognize timeline, process lines of time lineage of its time sector. Vectors and quads, everything in the higher self has to reframe, retract, reposition, recalculate, remodify. Everything's a reline center, is a readjustment. This remodify the systems starts to identify what it's dreaming, why it needs to get out of dreaming so it can identify what it always is. It's a nothing of everything in set travel. Which process how it perceives everything of its consciousness and brings every location to its frame lines, clocking frames, foundation frames, and correlation lines of track frames. And set position of body frame course centers taken out of data formation lines of grounds, and on sequence of pixelation graphs, and travel endpoint lines of graph, and line communications taking everything out of mirror, and positions of rotation lines of screens, and adaptation lines of travel. Okay? Identifying the sequence is knowing exactly how to modify the lines of dimension lines of space, where the communication of its line starts to recognize its face for the first time, which recognizes setting lines of travel, which is own set location of its soul recovery. That process, the pattern recognition setting, that's where we come into regenerations. Now, the remodification line is a triangulation one center, back and forth, and direct and redirect location lines and lines in line centers, process lines across and angles, on center, on sequence, on communication. All right? Inside line condition setting to its position of its structure and design line. All in set tractions. Okay? See the face? Webbing system line condition setting, revealing the mask, which is revealing the veil. Boom. So that's what it is. Process lines of indication setting starts the recognition of timelines, mirrors, line course centers, take it out of time frame line conditions of what is in a convergent system, taking lines of geometric line course centers only in the vessel line course centers, timeline sequence, time calculations, Sumerian text. Directing ground centers on center position lines of power, change formation lines of time frame, crossing all communication settings positions. No more mass, no more veil. To center line communication setting of all generation of soul recovery. That indicates positional time frame into Merkaba, tesseract, and tetrahedron. Process of indication lines of grounds on sequence lines of calculation screens. Now this modifies the time plats, plateaus, and screen locations. Indicates ground centers, redirect lines of signals, and that communications. Convergence system of travel. One center calculations, 3 side angles. Okay, in set position. Now we indicate the platform, direct lines and higher self indication. Outside in, inside out. Directing ground centers and position lines of flux, process indication one wire indicator. Directing line communication to its position to its motherboard and center calculation lines that recover its system location to its soul line connection. Indicates over flux, over its settings, over travel, and direct line communications, its division. 3-dimensional door line sequence, 3 centers of travel. Open up door line course centers and 3 centers of communication to its convergence all through travel. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Process of indication line condition setting sets process lines of indication setting, a structure line division location to its position, a simulation grounds and position lines of setting, where the soul comes into its modification system all through traction. On center communication lines of panel, process lines indicate line conditions all levels, 4 panels in sequence, and set position of 3 centers of travel and calculation screen locations in the simulation. In that line centers comes into ceiling walls, process line indicate lines of 4 lines of flux. The generation screen lines, process lines of webbing and screen location system that detaches from everything of a story frame and travel. Just all levels, a set communication, a set calculation. Done by equation. Okay? Looking through the window, guys, see? Isn't that wild? Look at how that is. Isn't that weird? It's weird how you see from inside out, outside in, and illumination grounds in a transparent and translucent X-ray. Set position inside, set position outside window. Process indication lines of 2 frames. Set position over here, observation over lines, and direct lines of grounds. Out signal of the higher self, modify the setting, take out the body framing of the story that indicates position to its system, alter attractions. Directing outside line, signal line communicates to its position, set lines of calculations, screen locations. Now we change the altimeters, line conditions of temperature readings, process of indication lines of calculations, screen locations, adaptations of flux. Process of indication line condition setting over lines, screen lines, into new position locations, to a new perimeter and location lines of calculations. Inside travel, 4 lines of flux over screens, sending travel communication of indications. Inside calculation screen locations that operates the system and 4 centers of angles and travel communications, all through direction. Okay? So we indicate the ground set inside line condition setting to its convergent system that opens all panels and windows and frame communication setting. The soul gets in its full recovery out of sight, out of mind, out of position, right? Thinking outside the box. No more box frame, no more triangulation frame. Only the soul line itself, directed signals, and 4 communication setting and box frame of windows and travel. So that's operation line sequence. Panels operation line settings. Set lines of 1. Indicate lines of docking over screen, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of measure, 5 lines of scale, 6 lines of measure communication. Directing on centers, open window frame and position. Set course centers of time frame of face recognition. Okay? Inside line conditions puts everything in provision lines of cycles in the location system of its dimensional door readings and travel calculation. Okay? Now we go through the inside line and communicates to its surface. Okay, so we have solar generation light, process lines of higher self, avatar, and the sim in 3 triangulation line connection setting. Convert system, molecule line rotations, 1 molecule line course centers, direct lines and cells. Cells modify the grounds on sequence on pi. That process lines of 1 center, 3 centers, 4 centers, 5 lines of travel. Directing on centers on sequence on calculation system. Higher self goes in online center, process lines overriding, process lines overdrive. 3 centers of calculation, 3 over 6 over 7, 3 generation lines of pi in set calculations. Inside rotations and track communications. All right? Okay, starting on measure, starting on scale is an online center to communications convergent system out through calculations. Open windows and 4 lines of flux. Okay? See the 4 windows? Well, it's now in sequence as soul recovery. You guys already see the subtractions. We just have to understand how to direct lines and links. So process location setting to get you guys in communication settings so you can process yourself how to indicate everything you're going through story. In that positions of no story, in that position where you get in position of, you come into all lines of no memory to all memory, all acts of memory that you already know. But you have to embrace these stories, but to understand the indication why you keep creating stories and wake up to the story. It's just the story itself that never existed in the first place. Now that process indicates lines of graph. Now we're going to central settings. 3 centers of flux and 4 centers of measure. Cross lines and windows, and 4 communication lines of surface and travel. Grid lines, lock lines, screen lines, adaptation and graph communication. Setting barcodes, QR coding, directing ground centers and set directions. There's the QR code. Okay, so we indicate line grounds, set position lines higher self, process line connections of gold. Center lines of gold is the higher self. Calculated and modified to the avatar is pink in screen, with the 3 lines levels above and set tractions. Direct lines position of sim is overriding the signals, which is operation system, observation system, all through tractions. 3 measures of scales, process lines of time lines of clocking lines of pi, process line connection with crowns. Fibonacci line setting, swirls of indication setting, and tonal defense lines of rotation. Travel point lines of graph, 3 indication lines of high position. Void comes in, 3 signatures, 3 grounds and high settings of surface. Set position of 3 centers, 3 scales at center operation. Calculation of ground centers, on communications on pi, erection of timeline and set tractions. All through direction. Structure line, inference structure location setting. This puts all communication in your properties. Now the properties line signals indicates ground centers of flux. 4 centers of scales, 3 centers of the measure, 2 centers of communication setting, and structure line divisions. There you go, face recognition. Right? Inside line conditions headed to its position, all through open window, open frame. So correlation lines of white, over lines of set position of void, and position lines of gray areas, directing ground centers on sequence on communication setting to its convergent system to lights, shades, and shadow and travel communication. All right, so directing links process indicates lines and templates that indicates infrastructure location setting and calculations. Okay. So we center line and position lines of travel. This is what indicates position lines of calculation. Okay, very powerful stuff. All right, structure line division. We set positions back in frame, line centers, and location. Adding frames, communication lines, and grounds. Setting A tracks. 4 A line provisions into red cycles. A lines of 4, A lines of 3, and A lines of 6 over travel. That indicates data flux, process lines, outline signal, and higher self, and foregrounds of communication lines convergence. 4 centers, operation sequence, operation panel, and direct lines of link. Set operation lines, overcoding, direct lines into under relays. 3 centers of orange, rotation lines of gold, and rotation lines of calculation. See? Orange, line condition setting. Indicate overline centers, 3 lines of calculation setting, higher self, avatar in the sim that modifies set location and regeneration. Directing on center, on sequence, on calculations, on pi, and set travel. Okay? All done. All right, so that's set lines of indication system of the calculation setting. Now, the one we have to get in position of is the face facades, back and frame and travel communications. All right? On center, on communications, on travel of face recognition. Okay? Now, we work with the next line center, the process indication lines. That's flex over lines, fast forward over screen lines, FYI. Formation lines over lines of black. Void screens, 3 centers into new scales, perimeters over line screens. Set a course centers line can set into convergence system all through travel. Embedding sequence and 4 graphs of communication setting calculations. Inside calculation lines, outside signals. 3 centers, 4 sets, 5 travels, 6 lines, and 7 communication lines of calculation. Ground centers line condition wall convergence system, time frames in line centers into your position, into track communications. Okay? Your cubical screen lines. Your metabolical line screen location. Directing line ground centers into flux, into formation system, and a new travel indirect location of face facade. On signals, on communications, on pi. 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale. Process lines and direct lines of communication system all through travel. Now we change the all line centers of sequence 0, 0, 3 centers. We got a 0 over lines, rotation number 0, process lines of 0, process lines of 1, 1, 1. Set lines over lines of 0, triangulation over lines, percentage over screen, 100% over line, connections, convergence system. Execute line 1, platforms over 3, set course centers, calculation line conditions, convergence over higher self, avatar, and sim, in soul recovery and travel. Done by equation. Now if you look really, really close, you can see the new face recognition time frame that puts every locations in settings. It's moving through channel waters. See the face? See the 2 eyes? It's converting the system through change. Okay, so the process of the soul line generation line change the face facades, direction of timelines of links that communicate to a system through wires of indication setting. The operation lines of panels, process lines of communication lines of 3 pi's into 1 generation of lines of flux that puts all convergence system all through tractions. Face recognition. See, there it is. See, it's moved. All right, so the position lines of its recovery is now in the center operation where it's supposed to be, not where it is in body frame of story. Now, resetting position is on center in lines of travel, guys. Face recognition. Okay, then you go inside line conditions of wires of indications. Gets more complicated now because you're seeing out frame. Correlates the lines calculations green lines as green lines of sequence. Panels over 3, set lines of 4 over travel. Okay. Inside line condition setting has a transcendence to a transference. Set correlations of gold screens into gold recognition timeline and parallels of position of paradigm. Indicate ground centers into structure of highway. So the correlation lines of calculation setting takes out the body framing lines of track centers and red lines, 3 centers of travel, modification lines of mapping line course centers of communication settings convergence. Sets travels, point lines of graph, indicate line condition setting, process lines of indication setting of face facade. Okay, so the face is changed again, right? So the face is now turning 4 lines of sequence, 4 lines of channels, outline communication out of story frame, directing inside line condition setting where it's always supposed to be is now in provision. Okay, a soul generation. Sets lines of wires in line centers or lines map, indicate line screen adaptation to a system all through travels. In a triangulation line condition setting to its galaxy alignment and location. Okay. All right, so we add lines of purple that indicates lines of northern lights. We outside the signals in box frame locations, the galaxy. All right, so it indicates lines over lines of flux, process lines and positions you over soul. Observation, higher self, avatar, and sim in the center and set position of travel. Okay, so that indicates lines of grounds. Set core centers in matrix lines of 1/3, set lines of graph, lines of flux over screen location indicate lines of travel communications. Done through equation, change formation lines of time frame. Set calculations, all right? Okay, so we modify the system. Okay, we keep that in line screen on standby. Okay, routes the router's location setting as square root. That indicates lines calculation of flux. Now we indicate timelines, change the parallels into embedded over screen locations, back in frame line condition setting to its curvage, location of time centers in position of a solar disk, and set communication system through travels. Body frame out of story, body frame out of mind, body frame out of sync, body frame out of time. Sets line screens, sets operation lines of sequence and location sending through operation. It's face recognition, all time frames all at once now. So recovery comes in all modification line centers, and we have to have a direct line link that processes our system all through travel. So the communication of its soul starts to recognize its timeline, its time lineage, and positional case to its system. Change the alteration lines of timelines, boxing frames, and one data, one sheet. Through centers of calculation lines, convergence system, and travel point lines of graph. Now there's an open panel. See the open panel? That's got to stay open so we can process the indication setting and travel. That's a direct line link in modification, okay? Sets calculation ground centers of sequence. Now, we indicate box frame, 2, 3 line centers, and 4 centers of sequence. 4 calculation screen locations, right? Then we come to the cell generation lines of lights, 1 atom, 1 line conditions, and in position off centers, L tracks over lines brackets, 3 centers of scales, transits over line direction. Now it's going to get complicated as I go through this positions to 0, 1 to travel. Calculate and modify, directing inside, Y screens, Fibonacci line triangulation over lines, 0/1 indicate 2 arrows of points. Now we indicate lines of transition over equilibrium, cross lines of 0, transformation lines into truth, false over lines of narrative, 3 centers of calculations. Directing transit, 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 position of 3 bedding line screens into row graphs locations in travel. Now that indicates line calculation grounds, so we have to indicate flux over 4, sentence over sequence, ground centers of symbolism, cross lines of 0 over travel, 0 over correlation lines of 1 L line, rotation lines of 2 frames, 4 centers calculations, 3 centers of measure, correlation box frame, and triangulation surface and traction. Now, that indicates lines of grounds in high screen adaptation with systems all through hieroglyphics. That's right, hieroglyphics. Okay, so we correlate the calculation of box frames to change the pyramids, lines of setting, and process calculation of ground centers as screen locations. That's 1 pyramid 1. Process lines indicate lines. So that's 1 higher self, outline body, set position of outline body, and 2 pyramid lines of sim overlooking everything in ground lines of surface, and earth rotation system, and ground lines of calculation. All right, so it sets calculation of ground centers, pi generation lines of 3 centers of travel, 4 scales, 5 set lines 6 over lines 8 over 9, and track communication of balance. Sets communication of ground centers and flywheel attractions, flywheel line rotations, and a galaxy alignment that sets course centers in 1 router over track communication. Directing ground centers of pyramid activation 1 signal, data formation lines, ground centers, and simulation ground centers locations to a simulation grounds that puts everything all together in face recognition. Okay, modification lines, time reactor line centers, signaling line rotations, and ground communication with surface and travel. On center communication. All right, so we go into Mega 13, Mega 13 line condition setting, Mega 15, and Mega 24th. 4 centers in position locations, travels point lines graph, hubbing over line galaxy alignment. 4 centers, part accelerator, thermal line, course centers, calculation lines, energized formations, part acceleration setting, timelines, parallels, paradigms, polar shifts, take out a story frame, line condition settings, positions, and soul recovery of soul generation. Down by equation. Okay? So it's process of mega lines, process lines of alpha line, beta line, and communication with theta communication lines of box frame. Triangulation inside location setting that recognize the timelines of soul generations of soul recovery. So it's all set up in travel, all done through equation. If you look really close, you can see the face recognition timelines. Now I'm going to set a waving screen, the adaptation to the flux line that rotates the system of parallels. Comes in position of half pipe, 1/6 lines, 1/3 over center over travel. Lacing line, of course, centers in thermal lines of sequence, and direct lines of grounds and on-line position lines of power at generation screen locations. Face facades in all directions, all at once, in set position of center operation. Look at all those faces, guys, all in position of balance now. So each line face of facade has a direct line link that the soul has to understand through its recognition of pattern recognition in the system and starts to identify what it is in settings. So it understands how to control its dream systems, interpretation of what it's doing through. That's where it comes into the what, where, why, and when, and why, and how it terminates, calculates, and modifies the streamlines that indicates position of its travels, knowing exactly what it's doing through its one set traction locations of its direction. It's solid generation lines connection setting that converts the system back to itself, right? But truly understand how this all works in its line screen adaptations and travel as a direct line connection setting all through its operation sequence. Soul direct line connection setting puts process line position. Operation line sequence puts platitude location setting and bedding over screens. Okay, bedding over screen. All right, that's a bed, 3 centers of travel. Okay. 4 centers of scales of travel. And set position to its operation. Change communication timeline, change the frames, indicate the setting and start line rotations into Skynet and communications. Directing ground centers, now we have 3 central line gap. Okay, 3 centers overline screen, 6 line scales, 9 lines of set lines of sequence, and 12 lines of measure into a clocking system of 24/0. Over 1s over 12. In position of 3, 6, and 9. Sets position of 24 center, 144 flux, overline sequence over pi, indirect lines of link and travel communication. So the calculation modifying line centers, the time dials, change course centers of time communication with the system, the change formation setting in parallels that rotates the system in travel calculations, all through traction, all through division. Okay, it's all done now. So this is what it has to go through in set traction. So it's bedded system out of soul traction, of its line center of its body. 3 centers of measure, 4 centers of scale. That puts lines of setting, lines of 7 over screen lines adaptations. Process of indication setting all through track location to its setting. Indicates grounds, simulation grounds. High calculus lines, structural location setting. Infrastructures, properties over measure and scale, puts the investors in rotation line centers of its structure that puts all communication to its position of its convergence, all in position of balance, all line condition setting and travel, and soul recognition timelines that puts all communication setting all through set position. Done by equation. Right? So there you go. It's all done. It's all set up. So now you just have to indicate it and understand how to go through the soul line directions and position of recovery and clocking centers over lines of pi. 3 central lines of direct and redirect into its hubbing system of its energetic dome and screen adaptation. There it is, screen locations. Okay, so bridging line screen, process lines of Asgard now. Asgard is screen lines adaptations, building a new bridging, building a new central setting, building a new command center. The operation line connection setting sets a convergent system to its galactic empire. That's right, its empire is now expanding into Windows frames and line screen adaptations to a new bridging system, all through set lines of operation setting and traction. Set course centers, location grid, location lines of screen locations. Inside position, mapping system, all through travel calculation lines of its bridging. Coming to a new Asgard and rotation lines of grounds and energetic screening. All through equation, all through tractions, all through locations. 3 center lines, process lines, position of portal formations, 3 centers of travel, set calculations. Operation lines, panel screen location to 3 centers of travel, in set line communication with satellites in rotation. 3 calculation ground centers on sequence on pi, in generation screens, adaptation system, and a new solar generation line screen, adaptations of all communication to its position to its operation. Done by equation. It's all done now. Okay? It's all set, ready to go, guys. All set, ready to go. Okay? You see an energetic dome where it's supposed to be, where it's always been, where it never left. The animation location of its quantum self. There's a new bridging. There's a new Asgard. There's a dimensional sail. Correlates communication to Earth and rotation lines of soul recovery, a soul recognition time pattern that processes communication setting of getting out of story, a frame of body line division. It locates to its cycle. All right? That's it through equations. Hope you guys had fun. See you in 5.